I'm going to share with you some detail about Amgen's experience managing through the pandemic. I speak frequently to my colleagues at other large biopharmaceutical organizations, and I'm quite sure that their experience is similar to ours. I'm not going to focus specifically on cardiovascular trials. I think everything I'm going to present to you is applicable to cardiovascular clinical research. I'll probably make a few comments as I go where there are specific points that are relative to CV research. So let me just take control of the screen, if I may. My overall message to you is that the long-term impact of COVID-19 on our clinical trial activities will be positive. In fact, I believe it will be very positive. In the short run, we've adapted to the challenges that the pandemic has posed to execution of clinical trials. We've adopted methodologies which were already in flight and in development, but their uptake, their adoption has been dramatically accelerated under the pressures of the pandemic. These include the utilization of telemedicine in cases where a direct contact between the patient and the investigative site is not necessary to gather regulatory quality information. It includes the direct shipment of study medicine to the patients. This is an option that was available to us before the pandemic, but became quite important when restrictions on travel and access to sites were imposed around the world. We and other companies were able to rapidly arrange for direct shipment of investigational product from sites to patients to allow uninterrupted administration of study treatments. We were also able to, in certain cases, to substitute local assessment close to the patient for assessments that would normally have been carried out at the investigative site. These include, for example, radiographic assessments in cancer trials. In cases where we were able to verify that a local facility could perform tests of adequate scientific quality, we're able to allow patients to have these tests done locally rather than travel to the investigative center. And then finally, and what I'll spend a few minutes talking about, under the pressure from the pandemic, we've dramatically increased our use of data and analytics. Some of them specific to the pandemic, and others of more general importance. These, of course, we've used analytics for years, but I would safe to say that they've become dramatically more important for us as we operate in a very dynamic and rapidly changing environment. Together, all of these things, I think, have accelerated a movement towards a clinical trial model that's more flexible and more convenient for the patients. And in this process, I think the regulators have been our partners. They've provided useful guidance on acceptable degrees of flexibility in trial execution. They've been very open to discussion as we work to ensure that the quality of the data that we collect is not compromised by a pandemic. Now, I'm just going to share with you one set of data, and that is the impact of the pandemic on startup and enrollment activities. We, like I think most companies, most organizations, evaluated our clinical trials study by study, country by country, site by site, and we made decisions around startup activities and enrollment, placing a highest priority on the safety of subjects and the integrity of the data. What that meant in practice is that during the worst of the pandemic, as the month of April, while it was flaring in Western Europe and in the Americas, while still not extinguished in the Asia Pacific region, almost half of our studies were to some degree paused during startup phase, and almost 3/4 of studies had to some degree enrollment paused. What was not affected during this time was subject follow-up, and I'll show you some data in a moment. And you'll see that for the most part, we've been able to continue to provide study medication and to conduct necessary evaluations on enrolled patients. Investigative sites worldwide place their highest priority on the safety of those already enrolled patients and the integrity of the data. And they were particularly, I think, careful to ensure that the large registrational trials, which were fully enrolled, continue to progress without interruption or threat to data integrity. What were slowed to a significant degree were early phase studies, particularly those involving normal volunteers, which there are typically many, being carried on at any time to support each investigational product, and which make up a large part of the numbers that you see on this slide. What you'll also see is that this was a very dynamic situation, and within the space of 2 months, virtually all of our studies have returned into startup, and the vast majority of studies are enrolling. And although this slide only summarizes the situation on June 1st, things have continued to rapidly improve, where essentially our entire portfolio is moving forward. Move on to the next slide. We've relied heavily on data to guide our decision making. Some of that data is epidemiologic data, which we've relied on to understand not only the current state, but what's likely to come in the coming months. We've developed a fairly rich body of epidemiologic projections to help us understand the possible range of outcomes of the pandemic. Here is just on this slide is just one summary of different scenarios that we've investigated, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. While this sort of data at a global level is quite useful, what's more useful in managing a portfolio of clinical trials is data at the country level. So we've also produced these Ridgeline plots that allow us to examine the potential course of the pandemic in each of the countries where we operate. These data inform our decisions, particularly around trial startup or enrollment. Because, of course, if we're going to begin to put patients into a trial, we'd like to be confident that over the coming months, the sites are going to have the resources and capabilities to care for those patients, and that the risk of pandemic worsening in those countries is acceptable. Now this sort of data is quite useful, but it's more useful when it's merged with local insights around the conditions on the ground. So we also, I think, we developed tools for our teams to use that combine the epidemiologic projections you see on the left side of this slide with detailed data from essentially local health authorities around various aspects of public life, including use of public transportation, stay-at-home orders, public gatherings, air travel. All data that inform our decisions around the operating conditions in the countries where we're conducting clinical trials and help us to make forward-looking plans that we feel we can rely on. And then finally, I think we've dramatically accelerated the use of data to allow us to assess the conduct, performance, and quality of clinical trials. What's displayed on this slide is just a snapshot of one report of these enhanced data visualizations taken again during the worst of the pandemic. It focused on, in the upper part of the slide, measures of study quality, including missed doses and missed visits and dosing deviations, which, as you can see, all increased during the month of April, but starting from a very, very low baseline and at levels that we felt, for the most part, we could manage using the flexibility that's afforded us to deliver medication to patients remotely and to, in some cases, to collect data remotely. In the lower panel of the slide are a more general panel of performance measures of both the summarizing effects on both enrollment and site activation, and then critically data collection and data quality. And here again, as we said, there was a sharp impact on enrollment in April, which has dramatically improved since that time, and relatively modest impacts on our ability to collect data and to resolve discrepancies in the clinical database. On the far right of the slide, you see week-by-week trend reports, which we also found extraordinarily useful in evaluating these data. Now, these reports could be generated at not only a global level, but also at a country level, at a site level, and at a study level. And as such, they were extraordinarily useful to our teams in countries responding to local conditions and working with the investigative sites to ensure continued flow of high-quality data and protection of subject safety. So, with that, perhaps if we can just return to the opening slide of the presentation, I will be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you for a fantastic presentation. This is extremely interesting. One issue, of course, is when you have trials which have mortality as outcome, whether your modeling says that, in fact, these might be influenced by the COVID pandemic.
Well, it is, of course, a topic that we're intensely interested in, and I think it's a particularly important topic for cardiovascular outcome trials, where the COVID-19 mortality represents a source of competing mortality that, if the rates were sufficiently high, could potentially interfere with your ability to assess the effect of study therapy on the patient outcomes. In our hands, it's obviously an issue that we have focused on intensely in our own cardiovascular portfolio. And to date, first of all, I would say that we have been able to determine vital status on our patients with a very high degree of completeness. I think we all know that today in cardiovascular trials, the expectation is that every patient who's randomized is followed, at least for vital status, to the completion of study. And I would say we've still been able to do that with considerable extra effort in spite of the challenges of the pandemic. And then we have seen some cases of COVID-19 within our outcomes trials, and some fatal, but not at a level that would at all interfere with our ability to assess the impact of study therapy.
That is very interesting to know, because we all want to know who are the patients who are most endangered by COVID-19, and often the cardiovascular patient, of course, is mentioned.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it seems that age is a substantial driver of mortality, and likely the very old are not so much enrolled in the trials. Is that a potential explanation why you see very little impact?
Well, I think I think it reflects the fact that the pandemic has only been at play for a few months in the geographies where we operate, and to date, the proportion of the general population that's been infected is somewhere between 1% and 10%. We don't know the precise number, but it's it's still a small minority of the population. And I think many countries, steps have been taken to protect vulnerable populations, which would include many of the patients we would enroll in, say, a heart failure trial. Although I think that the level of concern is appropriate to date, the impact has been modest. Now, if we were starting a trial today and expected that for the full duration of the trial that the study therapy would be administered in the setting of the pandemic, then I think we might have a more serious concern.
Yeah. I would once again like the audience to submit your question. Encourage the audience to submit your questions. There is no bad questions. So whatever comes to your mind, send us. And of course, I personally was, like many others, probably most intrigued when I saw the modeling that you did based on the data that you had available on potential future behavior of this pandemic.
Yeah.
And, well, then here the question goes, which one of those do you think is most realistic?
Well, I think, now you're asking me to speak beyond my area of expertise. But I do think that, we in the trial community should be prepared for certain parts of the world to be severely affected through the summer, fall, and winter of this year. And I don't think that I would offer a global projection, because I think certain regions have been far more successful at containing the spread of the virus than others. I won't name the regions which are less successful. I think for a European audience, it's probably not necessary.
Here's a question that came in specifically to you, whether you have specific trials studying COVID treatment, and it likely might be either COVID treatment or the influence of other treatments on COVID-19.
Yes, so the answer is yes, we do, and we are active in developing therapeutics for COVID-19. I think we have an immunomodulatory therapy in our portfolio that's potentially of use in treatment of COVID-19 associated pulmonary disease. That therapy is a Apremilast or a Tesla PDE4 inhibitor. We are collaborating with a number of entities to incorporate Apremilast into platform trials to study its value in various stages of the disease. And in fact, we hope that the first of those trials will begin dosing within the next few days. Like I think many organizations, we feel that it's critically important to support platform trials for testing therapeutics. They represent the framework within which we can most rapidly test a variety of therapies and gain clinically useful data. So we focused on joining existing platform trials or supporting initiation of new trials where our therapy can be tested alongside other therapies. We've also launched a project to develop monoclonal antibodies, which could potentially be used in both treatment and in prophylaxis in high-risk settings. That work is still in a preclinical stage, but proceeding with I think a great deal of enthusiasm in partnership with a biotech company with a deep experience in immunophenotyping, as well as our company's Decode Genetics affiliate based in Iceland. So I think it is a time for really everybody to step up and do their part in confronting the pandemic, and I'm just proud to be a member of an organization that's contributing.
If I may ask one more question, and then I really have to let Isabel also, speak a bit. Now, there's of course the potential idea that individuals, before you enroll them in the trial, you would like to know their COVID status, right? At the moment, you say the degree of the population that has been infected is relatively low, but is it conceivable that before you can enroll a patient into a trial, you might need to know, whether antibodies are present, whether he or she has had the disease or not? Is that something that you are considering?
Well, I think that at the present time, I think we don't know enough about the performance characteristics and predictive value of antibody tests to know their value in this setting or in others. Obviously, there's a great deal of interest in antibody testing as a tool for risk stratification in general populations, and which might be of utility in helping countries manage the outbreak. But I think it's my perspective that at this point that would still be premature. I think at a minimum we still don't really understand the extent to which positive tests, even from a validated, reliable platform, are predictive of meaningful immunity to the virus.
Isabel?
So, Elliott, as we are speaking about the treatment of COVID, what about the vaccines? What is your view on that? And are we partnering with some vaccine programs at Amgen, or are you aware of some programs that are of particular interest?
Well, I think I think as probably the audience is aware, there are a very large number of vaccine programs in flight, somewhere around 150. We are currently not one of the companies that's developing a vaccine. We focused on areas where we feel that our capabilities as a company are probably of greatest value, but obviously all companies are eagerly hoping for a vaccine. I think every organization, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, recognizes that what's most important here is to get us as quickly as we can to a state of mass immunity, so that governments, healthcare systems, and businesses can return to normal operations as quickly as possible.
Thank you.